In the scorching summer of 1876, Jake Morrison discovered more than just water at a forgotten homestead in the Arizona Territory when he found Sarah and Ruth Williams, two educated African-American women cast aside by their polygamist husband for failing to bear children after 3 barren years of marriage. The sisters had been surviving on their own for 2 months, their supplies dwindling and their neighbors growing increasingly hostile, unaware that the weathered cowboy who rode into their lives carried both their salvation and a secret that could destroy them. Sarah, 26 and fierce with determination, met Jake's arrival with suspicion sharp enough to cut through the desert heat, while Ruth, 2 years younger and still clinging to hope, offered him water and a place at their meager table. What began as a simple stop to rest his horse became something far more complicated. When Jake realized, he recognized the property boundaries from a legal document hidden in his saddlebags, a document that would force him to choose between the job he was paid to complete and the 2 women who were about to change everything he thought he knew about loyalty. Jake Morrison had spent 15 years drifting from town to town with nothing but his horse and his word to call his own. But something about the way Sarah Williams stood her ground against a world determined to break her made him wonder if he was finally ready to stop running. Jake Morrison rode hard across the cracked earth, his shirt stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. Smoke rose behind him like a funeral pyre against the pale sky. The land deed in his vest pocket felt heavier than lead. He should have told her the truth from the beginning. The horse beneath him stumbled. Jake pulled the reins and looked back at the distant smoke. 3 months. 3 months since he'd first seen her standing in that doorway with fire in her eyes and dust on her boots. 3 months earlier, the same horse had carried him toward what he thought would be easy money. The sun hung merciless overhead when Jake first spotted the homestead. His canteen had been empty since dawn. The horse needed water more than he needed pride. A woman appeared in the doorway before he'd even dismounted, dark-skinned with shoulders squared like she was ready for war. Her dress was mended in 3 places but clean. She held a rifle with the easy grip of someone who knew how to use it. Jake raised his hand slowly. "Just looking for water, ma'am." "Water costs $1. That's steep for something that falls from the sky." "Not much falling lately." Another woman emerged from behind the first, younger, softer around the edges but with the same careful eyes. She touched the first woman's arm. "Sarah, he looks half dead." "Sarah." Jake filed the name away. He'd been carrying a deed with property markers that matched this land for 2 weeks now. The man who'd hired him said it would be empty, said the previous occupants had moved on. These women didn't look like they were planning to move anywhere. "Please," the younger woman said. "At least let him water his horse." Sarah's grip on the rifle didn't loosen. "You passing through or staying?" "Passing through." "Good." She stepped aside. Jake led his horse to the well. The water was clear and cold. He drank first, then let the horse drink its fill. The younger woman brought him a tin cup and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "I'm Ruth," she said quietly. "That's my sister, Sarah." "Jake Morrison." Ruth smiled. It transformed her whole face. "You're the first person to stop here in weeks who wasn't trying to run us off." Jake chewed the cornbread slowly. It was good, better than anything he'd eaten in days. "Why would they want to run you off?" Sarah answered from the porch. "Take a guess." Jake looked between the sisters. The land around them was harsh but not worthless. The well was good. The cabin was small but solid. Someone had put real work into this place. "Your husband around?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ruth's smile faded. Sarah's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. "No husband," Sarah said. "Not anymore." "He left us," Ruth added softly. "Said we were cursed. Said God was punishing him through us." Jake waited for more. Ruth looked at her hands. 3 years we tried. 3 years of prayers and hope and nothing. Ruth's voice barely carried across the yard. He said barren women were a burden he couldn't bear. Sarah made a sound like spitting. "He took everything." left us the deed to this patch of dust and rode off to find himself a more fertile wife. Jake's hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket. The deed there felt like it was burning through the fabric. He'd been hired to reclaim this land legally. Simple job. Find the property, confirm it was abandoned, file the papers. Ezekiel Williams had been very specific about the boundaries, very specific about the timeline, very specific about the money Jake would earn for completing the task quickly and quietly. Looking at Sarah's defiant stance and Ruth's quiet dignity, Jake realized nothing about this job was going to be simple. Thunder rumbled in the distance. All three of them looked toward the horizon. Dark clouds were building against the mountains. "Storm coming," Jake said. "Always is out here." Sarah finally lowered the rifle. "You best move along before it hits." Jake mounted his horse. The deed seemed to weigh more with each passing moment. These women had been abandoned once already. They didn't need to know that the man who'd left them was still scheming to take what little they had left. "Much obliged for the water." Ruth stepped forward. "If you're ever passing through again, you're welcome to stop." Sarah shot her sister a sharp look but said nothing. Jake touched his hat brim and rode toward the approaching storm. Behind him, he heard the cabin door close with a soft thud. He made it maybe 100 yards before the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time he'd gone a mile, the sky had opened up completely. Jake Morrison had spent 15 years drifting from one job to the next, carrying other men's secrets and doing their dirty work for clean money. He'd learned to sleep easy by telling himself that business was business, and conscience was a luxury he couldn't afford. But something about the way Sarah Williams had stood her ground in that doorway, rifle ready and spine straight despite everything that had tried to break her, made him pull his horse to a stop in the driving rain. He sat there for a long time, water streaming off his hat, thinking about empty deeds and full coffers and two women who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. When he finally turned his horse around and rode back toward the homestead, Jake told himself he was just seeking shelter from the storm. He told himself a lot of things that night that he knew weren't entirely true. The storm lasted 3 days. Jake spent them in the Williams sisters' barn, mending harness leather and listening to rain drum against the roof like impatient fingers. Sarah brought him meals without conversation. Ruth lingered to talk. On the 4th morning, the sun returned, with a vengeance. Jake found Sarah wrestling with a fence post that had worked loose in the mud. The wood was rotted through at the base. He picked up a shovel without asking permission. Sarah straightened. Sweat beaded her forehead despite the early hour. "I can manage." "Didn't say you couldn't." Jake dug around the post. The rot went deeper than it looked. Most things did out here. Sarah watched him work, her arms crossed like armor. "You said you were passing through." "I am." "Been 4 days." Jake pulled the ruined post from the ground. The wood crumbled in his hands like old bones. "Storm held me up." "Storm's over." Jake met her eyes. Dark as coffee and twice as bitter. "So it is." He walked to the woodpile behind the cabin, found a piece of pine that would serve. Sarah followed at a distance, her boots crunching on gravel still damp from the rain. Ruth appeared with a bucket of water. The well's running clearer. Now, all that rain stirred up the good water underneath. Jake accepted the dipper she offered. The water was cold and sweet, better than anything he'd tasted in months. Ruth smiled at his expression. "Daddy always said this land had good bones. Just needed someone to treat it right." Sarah's face went hard. "Daddy said a lot of things." Ruth's smile faded. She carried the bucket back toward the cabin. Jake watched the exchange, filing away another piece of the puzzle. Dead fathers and missing husbands. Promises broken and ground too hard for easy planting. He sank the new post deep, packed earth around it with his boot heel. The fence line ran straight now, strong enough to hold whatever they needed it to hold. Sarah ran her hand along the top rail. "Testing. You do good work." "Had practice." "Where?" Jake wiped sweat from his neck. The sun was climbing toward noon. "Here and there. Wherever fence posts need setting." Sarah's laugh held no humor. Man of mystery. Jake shouldered the shovel. The deed in his pocket felt heavier in daylight. Ezekiel Williams had been clear about the timeline. Find the property, confirm abandonment, file the claim. Simple work for simple pay. Nothing about Sarah's stubborn presence or Ruth's gentle hope was simple. I could fix that roof leak too, Jake heard himself say. Above the kitchen, saw water stains on the ceiling. Sarah studied his face like she was reading fine print. What do you want in return? Meals and a place to sleep until the job's done. What job? Jake gestured toward the fence line. 3 more posts needed replacing. The gate hung crooked on worn hinges. Place needs work. We can't pay you. Didn't ask for pay. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She'd been hurt before, recently and deeply. Trust came hard when you'd been left with nothing but broken promises and a deed to dusty ground. 1 week, she said finally. Then you move on. Jake nodded. 1 week would give him time to figure out what came next. Time to decide whether 30 pieces of silver was worth the look in Ruth's eyes when she talked about her father's dreams. The work fell into rhythm. Mornings on the fence, afternoons on the roof, evenings sharing simple meals while the desert cooled around them. Sarah cooked with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make much from little. Ruth tended a small garden behind the cabin where tomatoes and beans grew in neat rows. Jake found himself looking forward to those evening hours. Ruth told stories about growing up in Kansas before the war. Sarah listened more than she spoke, but sometimes Jake caught her watching him with something softer than suspicion. On the 6th day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Jake recognized the horse before he could make out the man. Bay gelding with white socks, belonged to Tom Calhoun, who owned most of the grazing land between here and town. Calhoun rode up to the fence line Jake had just finished repairing. The man was soft around the middle but hard around the eyes. Money and power had made him comfortable with taking what he wanted. Morrison, Calhoun, heard you were working out here. Jake set down his hammer. Word travels fast. Fast enough. Calhoun's gaze moved to the cabin where Sarah stood in the doorway. These women causing you trouble? No trouble. Good. Hate to see a white man get mixed up in something complicated. The words hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Jake felt Sarah's eyes on his back. Ruth had stopped weeding her garden. Meaning? Calhoun leaned forward in his saddle. Meaning some situations are best left alone. These women won't last another winter out here. Nature has a way of sorting things out if you let it. Jake picked up his hammer, tested its weight. Seems to me they're doing fine. For now. Calhoun straightened, but winter's coming. And folks in town are starting to talk about property values, about the kind of neighbors they want. What kind is that? Calhoun's smile was thin as paper. The kind that belong. He wheeled his horse around and rode back the way he'd come. Jake watched until he disappeared into the wavering distance. When he turned around, Sarah was gone from the doorway. That night, supper was quieter than usual. Ruth tried to fill the silence with chatter about her garden, but her voice sounded forced. Sarah pushed food around her plate without eating. Finally, Ruth set down her fork. What did that man want? Jake considered his words carefully. To deliver a message. What kind of message? The kind meant to scare folks into moving along. Sarah's head came up. Fire flickered behind her eyes. We're not moving. Didn't figure you were. This is our land. Legal and proper. Jake nodded. The deed in his pocket seemed to burn against his ribs. Sarah's land. Legal and proper. Until someone with better lawyers and deeper pockets decided otherwise. Ruth reached across the table and touched her sister's hand. Maybe we should think about it. Winter will be hard, and if the town doesn't want us here, the town can go to blazes. Sarah pulled her hand away. I'm tired of running. Tired of being pushed around by men who think they know what's best for me. She looked directly at Jake when she said it. The challenge in her voice was clear as ringing steel. Jake met her gaze without flinching. Some fights are worth having, and some aren't. Depends on what you're fighting for. Sarah pushed back from the table. I'm fighting for the right to exist somewhere without permission. She walked outside. The screen door closed behind her with a soft click. Ruth started to follow, but Jake caught her arm gently. Let her be. Sometimes a person needs to sit with their anger before they can see past it. Ruth sank back into her chair. She's scared. We both are. Every day we wake up wondering if this will be the day someone comes to take it all away. Jake stared at his plate. The food had gone cold. Outside, night settled over the desert like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in the darkness, Sarah was wrestling with demons he'd helped create. The letter from Ezekiel Williams arrived the next morning. The letter arrived with the weekly supply wagon. Ruth brought it to Jake while he worked on the barn door. Her face was pale as morning frost. It's addressed to you, but it mentions the property. Jake's hands went still on the hinge he'd been oiling. The envelope bore Ezekiel Williams' careful script. Jake had seen that handwriting on the original contract, on the deed that still burned like a coal in his vest pocket. He took the letter without opening it. Ruth lingered, wrapping her shawl, tighter despite the desert heat. Bad news? Probably. Ruth's eyes searched his face. Jake, what aren't you telling us? The question hung between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Jake folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt. The paper felt thin as a death warrant. Some things are better left buried. Not if they're trying to claw their way to the surface. Jake looked toward the cabin where Sarah was hanging laundry on the line. Her movements were sharp, efficient. Every gesture spoke of a woman who'd learned to carry her own weight in a world determined to knock her down. Ruth. Jake's voice was quiet as prayer. If you knew something that could help your sister, but telling it might destroy what you've built here, what would you do? Ruth followed his gaze to Sarah. I'd tell her the truth. Sarah can handle anything except being lied to. That evening, Jake walked to the ridge behind the cabin. The letter lay open in his hands, Ezekiel's words crawling across the page like insects. Morrison, time grows short. File the claim within the week or forfeit your payment. The women's tenure grows more tenuous daily. Complete the work. Jake crumpled the paper. The desert wind caught it and carried it into the darkness. Below, lamplight glowed in the cabin windows. Sarah and Ruth moved like shadows behind the curtains, preparing for another night in the home they'd fought to keep. 3 weeks. Jake had been here 3 weeks, mending their fences and sharing their table while carrying the instrument of their destruction in his pocket. Every meal felt like betrayal. Every shared laugh cut like a blade. He'd told himself he was buying time, looking for another way, but time was a luxury none of them could afford. Jake stayed on the ridge until the cabin went dark. Then he walked back through the desert, guided by starlight and the weight of his own conscience. The next morning brought visitors. Ruth spotted them first, 3 riders coming hard from the direction of town. She called to Sarah, who emerged from the chicken coop with eggs in her apron. Jake stepped out of the barn. He recognized 2 of the horses, Calhoun's bay gelding and another mount from his ranch. The 3rd rider was a stranger, but the cut of his clothes and the quality of his tack spoke of money and authority. The men reined up at the fence line. Calhoun tipped his hat in mock courtesy. Morning, ladies. Morrison. Sarah set the egg basket on the porch steps. Her hand found the rifle leaning against the doorframe. State your business. The well-dressed stranger dismounted. He carried a leather satchel and the confidence of a man accustomed to having his words carry weight. I'm Henry Dalton, Territorial Land Commissioner. I'm here about irregularities in your property deed. Ruth moved closer to her sister. Jake felt the familiar weight of the real deed against his ribs. His hands hung loose at his sides, ready. What irregularities? Sarah's voice was steady as stone. Dalton opened his satchel. Questions have been raised about the legal transfer of this property, about whether the previous owner had clear title to convey. Ezekiel Williams was my husband. This land was part of our marital property. According to territorial records, Mr. Williams's claim to this property was never properly filed. There may have been a clerical error. Jake stepped forward. What kind of error? Dalton's eyes flicked over Jake dismissively. The kind that renders deeds invalid and property claims void. Sarah's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. This is our home. I understand your attachment, miss, but law is law. If the original claim was improperly filed, subsequent transfers become null and void. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. What does that mean? Calhoun answered with a thin smile. Means this land reverts to territorial jurisdiction, available for proper claim by qualified settlers. The morning air grew thick with unspoken threats. Jake watched Sarah's face, saw the exact moment hope died in her eyes. She'd been abandoned before, betrayed by men who spoke of law and righteousness while reaching for what wasn't theirs. How long do we have? Sarah asked. The commissioner will need to examine your documentation. If proper title cannot be established within 30 days, you'll need to vacate. Dalton remounted his horse. I trust you'll cooperate with this investigation. The three men rode away, leaving dust and silence in their wake. Ruth sank onto the porch steps like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Sarah stood frozen, the rifle forgotten in her hands. Jake walked to the woodpile, picked up his axe. The blade bit deep into seasoned pine, splitting the wood clean through. Another swing, another split. The rhythm helped him think. Ruth found him there an hour later. Her eyes were red from crying. Sarah's inside, going through every paper Daddy left us, every receipt and letter and scrap of documentation. Ruth's voice broke on the words. She knows it won't be enough. Jake set down the axe. The pile of split wood had grown substantial, enough to keep them warm through winter if they were still here to see it. What will you do? What we always do. Fight until we can't fight anymore. Then figure out how to keep fighting anyway. Ruth looked toward the cabin. She's talking about selling everything we can't. Carry. Moving north, maybe to Colorado. Starting over with whatever we can scrape together. Jake's chest tightened. The deed in his pocket contained the truth that could save them. The same truth that would reveal his own betrayal. He'd come, here to steal their home. Instead, he'd found something he didn't know he'd been looking for. Ruth. Jake's voice was rough as sandpaper. What if I told you there might be another way? Hope flickered in her eyes like candlelight in wind. What way? Jake looked at the cabin where Sarah was fighting a battle she couldn't win with weapons. That wouldn't serve. Then he looked at Ruth, who still believed in the possibility of justice despite everything the world had taught her about disappointment. I need to show you something, but once I do, there's no going back. Ruth straightened her shoulders. There's already no going back. That night, Jake walked Ruth to the ridge where he'd burned Ezekiel's letter. The original deed lay open between them, its pages catching moonlight like captured stars. Ruth read in silence. Her breathing grew shallow as the truth sank in. When she finished, she looked at Jake with eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. This says the land belonged to our father, that he filed proper claim before he died. That's right. But Ezekiel's deed was forged. Jake nodded. The weight of 3 weeks' deception sat heavy on his shoulders. Ezekiel hired me to reclaim this property, said you'd abandoned it, said it was rightfully his. Ruth's hands trembled on the document. He sent you to steal our home. He sent me to steal what he thought was his home. Turns out he was the thief all along. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Ruth folded the deed carefully, like she was handling something precious and fragile. Sarah will never forgive you for lying. I know. She'll never trust you again. I know that too. Ruth met his eyes. But this could save us. It could, if she'll let me help. Ruth stood, brushing dust from her skirt. The deed was clutched tight in her hand. There's only one way to find out. They walked back toward the cabin where Sarah waited, surrounded by useless papers and dying hope, unaware that salvation and betrayal wore the same face. Ruth pushed open the cabin door. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered papers like fallen leaves after a storm. Her father's letters, marriage certificates, bills of sale. None of it would be enough. Sarah didn't look up. I've been through everything twice. Daddy's original claim papers aren't here. Ezekiel must have taken them when he left. Ruth moved closer. The deed felt heavy in her hands. What if they weren't lost? Then where are they? Ruth placed the document on the table. Sarah's eyes focused on the unfamiliar handwriting, the official seals, the property boundaries that matched their land exactly. Sarah read in silence. Her breathing grew shallow. When she reached the signature at the bottom, her hands began to shake. Where did you get this? Ruth glanced toward the door. Jake stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. His face was carved from shadow and regret. From him. Sarah's head snapped up. She looked at Jake like she was seeing him for the first time, or maybe seeing him clearly at last. You've had this the whole time. Jake stepped into the room. Yes. While I tore this place apart looking for proof we belonged. Here. Yes, Sarah stood slowly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor like a closing coffin lid. Why? Jake met her eyes. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth, naked and sharp as a blade. Ezekiel hired me to reclaim this property. Told me it was rightfully his. Told me you'd abandoned it. The words fell into silence deep as a grave. Sarah's face went through a dozen expressions before settling on something harder than stone. Get out. Sarah, please. Get out of my house. Ruth stepped between them. Sarah, wait, the deed proves Daddy's claim was legal. It proves Ezekiel forged his papers. I don't care. Sarah's voice was quiet as death. I don't care if it saves us. I won't be helped by another man who came here to destroy me. Jake set his hat on the table. I'm not him. Aren't you? Sarah's laugh was bitter as alkali water. You came here with lies, ate at my table while planning to steal my home. How exactly are you different? Jake had no answer for that. Because she was right. Because the only difference between him and Ezekiel Williams was timing and a change of heart that came too late to matter. Sarah. Ruth's voice was soft as prayer. He could have filed that claim weeks ago, could have taken everything and disappeared. But he didn't. He was waiting for the right moment, weren't you, Jake? Waiting until we trusted you completely before you twisted the knife. Jake shook his head. I changed my mind. The first day, seeing what you'd built here, what you were fighting for. Then why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake looked at Ruth, who nodded encouragement, looked at Sarah, whose trust he'd broken before she'd even had a chance to give it. Because I knew you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now. Sarah turned away. She walked to the window and stared out at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. The fence posts Jake had replaced, the roof he'd mended. Every improvement was tainted now by the knowledge of his original purpose. I want you gone by morning. Jake picked up his hat. What about the deed? What about it? Dalton's coming back in 3 days. You'll need proof that your father's claim was legal. Sarah didn't turn around. I'll figure it out. Sarah. Jake's voice was rough as desert wind. Let me help you finish this. You've helped enough. Jake nodded. He'd expected nothing different, deserved nothing better. He walked toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, these 3 weeks were the best I've had in 15 years. Sarah's shoulders tensed. She didn't respond. Jake walked out into the desert night. Behind him, he heard Ruth's voice, soft and urgent, trying to bridge a gap that had grown too wide for words. 3 days later, riders appeared on the horizon. Not 3 this time, but 7. Ezekiel Williams rode in the center, flanked by Calhoun, and Dalton and 4 men Jake didn't recognize. They came fast and hard, kicking up dust that hung in the air like judgment. Jake watched from the ridge where he'd been camping. Sarah had told him to leave, but she hadn't said how far. Some orders were meant to be interpreted creatively. The riders surrounded the cabin. Ezekiel dismounted first, his movements sharp with authority and barely contained rage. He'd learned about the deed somehow, come to reclaim what he'd never legally owned. Sarah emerged from the cabin. No rifle this time, just her father's deed held high in her right hand. This land belongs to us legally. Ezekiel stepped forward. That document is stolen property. It's proof that your claim was forged. Dalton moved between them. If there are questions about document authenticity, they'll need to be resolved through proper channels. Calhoun spoke up. Lot of questions about how that deed came to light, about who might have been hiding evidence. Jake understood. They'd twist the truth until it served their purposes. Make Sarah look like the thief instead of the victim. One of Calhoun's men moved toward Sarah. She stepped back, clutching the deed tighter. That's when Jake made his choice. He rode down from the ridge at full gallop, arriving in a cloud of dust and determination. All 7 men turned toward him, hands moving toward weapons. Jake dismounted slowly. His own gun stayed holstered. Problem. Here, gentlemen. Ezekiel's eyes went narrow. Morrison, I should have known you'd crawl back once you smelled money. Jake smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Funny thing about that money, Ezekiel. I decided I didn't want it after all. He pulled out his original contract and tore it in half. The pieces fluttered to the ground like broken promises. You're making a mistake, Ezekiel said. Made plenty of those. But not today. Jake looked at Sarah. She stood frozen, the deed still clutched in her hand. Her face showed confusion, hope, and something that might have been forgiveness fighting for control. The deed's real, Jake announced to the assembled men. Samuel Williams filed proper claim to this property in 1858. His daughters are the legal heirs. Dalton shifted uncomfortably. That's for the courts to decide. Already been decided. Filed the paperwork with the territorial office yesterday, along with a sworn statement about how Ezekiel Williams forged his claim documents. Ezekiel's face went red. You lying snake. Jake's hand drifted toward his gun. Careful with your words. The standoff stretched like a taut wire. 7 men, against 1 cowboy and 2 women who'd been pushed as far as they were willing to go. Then Ruth appeared in the doorway. She held Jake's rifle with the same easy competence her sister had shown weeks earlier. I think you gentlemen should leave. Now. Calhoun laughed. 2 women and a broken-down cowboy against 7 of us. Sarah stepped forward, against 3 landowners defending their legal property against trespassers. The distinction mattered. Everyone knew it. Property rights were sacred in the territory, even when the property owners weren't the preferred color. Dalton remounted his horse. This matter will be settled in court. Looking forward to it, Sarah replied. The 7 men rode away, taking their threats and their swagger with them. Jake watched until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned to face Sarah. She looked at him for a long moment. The deed was still in her hand, creased but intact. You filed the papers? Yesterday, along with a statement about Ezekiel's forgeries and my own part in his scheme. Sarah nodded slowly. You could have kept riding. Could have, didn't see much point in it. Ruth lowered the rifle. What happens now? Jake looked at the cabin they'd defended, the land they'd fought to keep, the home they'd built from hope and stubbornness and pure refusal to surrender. Now we wait for the lawyers to sort it out, could take months. Sarah walked closer, close enough that Jake could see gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to count the freckles the desert sun had scattered across her nose. Will you wait with us? Jake settled his hat more firmly on his head. If you'll have me. Sarah smiled. It was small and careful, but it was real. I reckon we've got room for one more. The desert wind picked up the pieces of Jake's torn contract and scattered them across the land that had become home. Above them, clouds gathered against the mountains, promising rain for the thirsty ground. Some promises were worth keeping, some ground was worth defending, some fights were worth having, even when the odds were long and the outcome uncertain. Jake Morrison had spent 15 years running from one place to another, carrying other people's secrets and doing their dirty work. But something about the way Sarah Williams had stood her ground in that doorway, rifle ready and spine straight despite everything that had tried to break her, had made him want to stop running. Home wasn't a place you came from. It was a place you chose to defend. A place where someone trusted you to stay even after they'd seen the worst parts of who you used to be. The three of them walked toward the cabin together, leaving footprints in dust that would soon bloom with desert flowers after the coming rain. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.